You looked in the mirror one morning and saw it. A strand of gray hair, and you were not even 30. Maybe you were still in your teens. For years, everyone had an explanation ready. Too much stress, bad sleep. Bad luck passed down from a grandparent. None of that is the real answer. Scientists have traced early gray hair back to something far bigger than stress or luck. They followed it into your DNA, and from there into a chain of human movement stretching back thousands of years, long before any modern country existed. What they found was not a random quirk. It was a marker, a small biological flag left behind by people who walked across continents, crossed rivers, and sailed into open ocean long before history was written down. This video is not really about hair. It is about tracing your body back to the people who built it, generation after generation, long before anyone kept records. For many people with East Asian, Southeast Asian, or South Asian roots, or mixed heritage from these regions, early graying is tied to population movements that predate the nations we live in today by thousands of years. This was never hidden on purpose. It got buried the ordinary way. Empires rose and fell, borders shifted, languages changed, records were lost in wars and floods. But your cells kept the record intact, even after the paperwork disappeared. We will walk through this slowly. First, the biology, so the ancestry part makes sense. Then the ancient groups connected to this trait. Then the migrations that carried it across half the planet. And finally, what this might mean for your own family story. If stories like this interest you, stay subscribed. We dig into buried history and hidden science like this every week. Let's start with what is actually happening under your skin. Every strand of hair gets its color from melanin produced by cells called melanocytes living at the root of each hair follicle. These cells make two kinds of pigment. One produces black and brown shades, the other produces red and yellow tones. The mix decides your natural hair color. But color is only half the story. The real question is what decides when those melanocytes stop working. Once they stop, the new hair growing out has no pigment left, and it comes in gray, then eventually white. Researchers found a strong answer in a gene called IRF4, short for interferon regulatory factor 4. This gene came under the spotlight after a large study, published in Nature Communications in 2018, examined the DNA of more than 6,000 people across Latin America. It was the first major study to focus specifically on graying hair as its own trait. The results were clear. IRF4 stood out as the strongest genetic factor tied to graying before the age of 30. Here is where it gets interesting. The specific version of IRF4 most closely linked to early graying was not spread evenly across the world. It showed up far more often in people with indigenous American roots, in East Asian and Southeast Asian populations, and in mixed communities with historical ties to those groups. European populations carried a different version entirely. South Asian populations carried yet another variation. That tells researchers something important. Early graying was not one single genetic accident that spread from one place. It appeared independently more than once, shaped by different pressures over time. The groups carrying the strongest version all trace back to a specific, distant chapter of human history. The question is, which chapter, and how far back it goes? To answer that, we need to look at a much bigger debate in population genetics. The debate over who actually settled the Asian continent first, and when. For most of the last century, the accepted theory was simple. A single wave of early humans left Africa, moved through South Asia, and eventually spread north into East Asia, branching out into today's populations over tens of thousands of years. That theory has since been overturned. As DNA sequencing became cheaper, after 2016, the scientists began pulling ancient genetic material from old bones and comparing it to people living today. East and Southeast Asia were not settled by one wave. They were shaped by several distinct waves of migration, arriving at different times from different directions. Some groups vanished, leaving no direct descendants. Others blended heavily with later arrivals. And some left genetic fingerprints specific enough to still be traced today, using markers connected to traits like early graying. In 2019, a joint research effort involving Harvard University, the Max Planck Institute, and several Chinese universities analyzed ancient DNA from over 200 individuals, spanning 10,000 years across East and Southeast Asia. People living in southern China, Vietnam, and Thailand more than 4,000 years ago were genetically very different from the people living there today. Their closest relatives were groups like the Andaman Islanders and indigenous communities in the Philippines and Malaysia, remnants of a much older layer of human settlement that predates farming entirely. Then, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, a major population expansion began out of the Yangtze River Basin, spreading south and southwest. These were farming communities, carrying early forms of what became the Austroasiatic and Austronesian language families. They brought rice, taro, and millet, and they brought their genes too, including pigmentation variants that affected how long melanocytes stayed active. These farming populations did not simply replace the people already living there. In some regions, they mixed almost completely, in others only partially. The result was a genetic mosaic spread across Southeast Asia and out into the Pacific. The early graying trait tracks closely along the route of this expansion. Not because graying gave anyone an advantage, but because the variant responsible was riding along inside the DNA of people who were already spreading rapidly. As those populations expanded and mixed, the traits spread with them. Geneticists call this genetic hitchhiking, one of the reasons certain neutral traits can end up working as reliable markers of ancestry. This is where the story gets personal. If your family comes from China, particularly from southern provinces such as Guangdong, Fujian, Yunnan, or Guangxi, and you started graying early, there is a strong chance your ancestry connects to a group known historically as the Baiyue. The Baiyue were not one ethnic group. They were a broad collection of non-Han peoples who lived across southern China long before the Han Chinese state expanded into the region. The name roughly translates to the 100 Yue, a catch-all for dozens of related tribes, sharing farming traditions and genetic backgrounds distinct from populations further north. They spoke early forms of what became the Tai-Kadai, Austroasiatic, and Proto-Austronesian language families. Descendants of these groups became the Zhuang people of Guangxi. Others became ancestors of the Vietnamese, the Lao, and the Thai. Still others migrated across open water and became ancestors of Taiwan's indigenous peoples, the Filipinos, the Malays, and communities across the wider Pacific. A study published in 2021 in Cell Research confirmed this. Most Southeast Asian populations today carry a genetic blend of this ancient Bayou-related layer, combined with later waves of migration from the north. Vietnamese populations lean more heavily toward the older Austroasiatic layer. Thai and Lao populations carry a stronger Tai-Kadai signature. Filipino and Indonesian populations carry Austronesian ancestry, tracing directly back to Taiwan, roughly 4,000 years ago. Running through every one of these groups, in different amounts, are the same pigmentation gene variants tied to early graying. If your background is Vietnamese, Thai, Filipino, Malay, Zhuang, Lao, Javanese, or from any of the dozens of related peoples across Southeast Asia, and your hair started graying young, the biology almost certainly leads back to this movement out of southern China. You are carrying a genetic signal from people who were farming along the Yangtze Delta before the pyramids of Egypt were built. Now let's turn to South Asia, where the story runs just as deep. If your ancestry comes from South India, Sri Lanka, or Bangladesh, and you gray young, you are looking at a related but separate genetic thread. South Asia has one of the most layered population histories on Earth, shaped by at least 3 major waves of mixing over more than 10,000 years. The oldest layer traces directly back to the original migration out of Africa, reaching South Asia somewhere between 50 and 65,000 years ago. Geneticists call the descendants of this earliest group Ancient Ancestral South Indians, or AASI. Their legacy is strongest today in tribal communities across South India, Sri Lanka, and among the Andaman Islanders. The second layer arrived with Neolithic farmers migrating from the region of modern-day Iran, roughly 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, mixing with the populations already there. This combination formed the Indus Valley ancestry component, the genetic profile carried by the people who built one of the world's earliest urban civilizations. The third layer arrived from the Central Asian steppe, around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, mixing further into populations already shaped by the first 2 waves. Genetic variants of IRF4 linked to early graying show up more frequently in populations carrying a higher proportion of that original AASI ancestry. This matches the pattern seen in Southeast Asia, where the trait concentrates in populations descended from the oldest layers of settlement before farming ever arrived. For South Asians who gray early, the trait may point all the way back to the very first humans to settle the subcontinent. Now, here's something researchers did not initially expect. Early graying shows up far more frequently and more intensely in certain mixed ancestry communities than early models predicted. When 2 populations carrying similar variants in the same gene combine, the result in their children is not always a simple average. Sometimes the traits stack. IRF4 and related genes work through dosage effects, meaning more copies of a variant can strengthen the effect. People with combined East Asian and Southeast Asian ancestry, or combined Southeast Asian and South Asian ancestry, often start graying earlier than either parent population would alone. This pattern showed up clearly once large consumer DNA testing companies began gathering huge amounts of customer data. Mixed ancestry individuals of Asian background were reporting early graying at rates that surprised researchers, not because the trait was new, but because mixed ancestry was concentrating it. The Philippines is a clear example. Early graying rates there are among the highest anywhere in Southeast Asia, matching the extraordinary complexity of Filipino ancestry. Indigenous Negrito populations represent some of the oldest human lineages in island Southeast Asia. Layered on top is Austronesian ancestry from Taiwan, and layered further on top are waves of mixing from southern China, the Indian subcontinent, Arabia, and Spain, accumulated over roughly 3,000 years of trade and colonial history. When that many pigmentation variants stack across generations, early graying gets reinforced from several directions at once. In some families, going gray by 25 is not unusual. Those families are carrying a living record of nearly every population that contributed to who they became. There is another angle rarely discussed involving what the ancient DNA record looks like once mapped geographically. When researchers published detailed analyses of ancient DNA from sites across Southeast Asia, India, and southern China in 2022 and 2023, spanning around 8,000 years, they kept finding the same surprising pattern. Ancient populations were far more genetically distinct from one another than modern populations living in those same regions today. What caused that shift? Thousands of years of constant movement gradually blended groups that had once been sharply distinct. Farming expansions, maritime trade networks, Bronze Age kingdoms, the spread of Hindu and Buddhist influence, Mongol disruption, and the southward growth of Chinese imperial power. Every event moved people. Moving people moves genes. Moving genes moves traits. The early graying variant is essentially a leftover marker, once tightly linked to specific ancient populations, carried forward as their descendants blended into the wider mosaic of modern Asian populations. This is why two cousins with nearly identical ancestry percentages can end up with completely different results. One goes fully gray by 30, the other barely shows a strand at 50. These variants sit on specific chromosome segments passed down almost randomly. Whether you personally inherited them may be chance, but the fact your family carries them is not. That is inheritance stretching back long before your grandparents, to people who lived along river deltas and mountain valleys thousands of years before their homelands had names. Now let's talk about the diaspora experience, because it touches millions of people directly. There are large communities of Asian descent scattered across the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Europe, who have lost touch with exactly where their ancestors came from. Generations of migration, cultural blending, intermarriage, and often war and displacement broke the chain connecting families to their own origin stories. For many people in these communities, early graying has quietly become a strange, unanswered question. It marks you as connected to something specific, but the explanation for what that something is has been lost. Consumer DNA testing has helped, but it has also been frustrating. People can now access rough ancestry breakdowns that were not available 20 years ago. The frustrating part is that reference databases used by major testing companies are still weighted heavily toward European and, more recently, East Asian populations. Southeast Asian groups, including Vietnamese, Filipino, Indonesian, Malay, Burmese, Cambodian, Lao, and Thai populations, remain underrepresented in these reference panels relative to their actual population size. South Asian representation has improved, but is still incomplete. Pacific Islander populations remain dramatically underrepresented. In practical terms, someone with Filipino ancestry might receive a result saying 60% Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander, with no ability to break that down further into possible Visayan, Ilocano, Malay, or Southern Chinese roots. The early graying trait, combined with other genetic markers, is one of the tools researchers now use to break these broad categories apart and identify specific ancient population threads hidden inside modern Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander ancestry. People who gray early and go looking for answers about their Asian ancestry are not just passive subjects of this research. Their own biology is part of the data driving it forward. There's another thread worth mentioning, involving a clear south to north pattern across East Asia. When early graying rates are mapped across the region, a distinct pattern shows up. Populations in southern China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific consistently show higher rates than populations in northern China, Korea, and Japan. Even within China, the frequency steadily decreases moving north. This lines up with what geneticists call the ancient Southern East Asian ancestry component, the genetic signature left behind by populations who lived in the region before large-scale farming expansions arrived. Wherever this ancient layer makes up a larger share of a population's ancestry, early graying tends to be more common. Wherever it has been diluted by later migrations from the north, the trait becomes less frequent. It is not a perfect pattern. Other genetic factors play a role, and sun exposure also affects melanocyte function over a lifetime. But the pattern is consistent enough that researchers use it as evidence when reconstructing the deeper population history of the region. Your hair is quietly keeping a record of an inheritance stretching back to people who crossed land bridges, sailed along coastlines, and moved through river valleys 10,000 years ago. The research into IRF4 does not stop at hair color. The same variants affecting melanocyte longevity also interact with your immune system, and some of these connections are turning out to be medically important. Researchers have found associations, though not proven direct causes, between the IRF4 variants tied to early graying and differences in immune function. IRF4 is primarily an immune-regulating gene. Its role in hair pigmentation is more of a side function of a gene, mostly involved in shaping how your immune system develops and responds to threats. These variants also influence T cells, B cells, and how your body responds to certain viral infections. Some researchers have proposed that these variants became common in Southern and Southeast Asian populations because they offered an immune advantage, not because of hair color at all. Tropical Asia has historically dealt with some of the highest levels of pathogen exposure anywhere on the planet, and variants in IRF4 that improved immune response may have been strongly favored by natural selection, with early graying simply riding along as a side effect. If that theory holds up, early graying in Asian populations is not only a marker of ancestry. It may also be a trace of an ancient immune adaptation, the biological cost of an immune system shaped by an environment your distant ancestors actually lived through. So here is what this means, in plain terms. If your family comes from East Asia, whether Chinese, Japanese, Korean, or Taiwanese, and you gray early, you are most likely carrying ancestry connected to the Bayou-related populations, the older Southern Asian genetic layer, or both. Generally, the earlier and more completely you gray, the higher the proportion of these ancient components you likely carry. If your family comes from Southeast Asia, whether Vietnamese, Filipino, Thai, Malay, Indonesian, Cambodian, Lao, Burmese, or any of the hundreds of ethnic groups across the region, early graying points toward the ancient Austroasiatic and Austronesian migration streams, and possibly even older hunter-gatherer ancestry that existed before those migrations began. If your family comes from South Asia, whether Indian, Sri Lankan, Bangladeshi, or Nepali, early graying may point specifically toward AESI ancestry, the oldest known genetic layer in South Asia, representing the first humans to settle the subcontinent. If your ancestry is mixed across these regions, early graying may be amplified by variants combining from multiple ancestral lines at once. And if your family background crosses the boundary between Asia and the Pacific, common among Filipino, Malay, Indonesian, and Pacific Islander families, your early graying may connect you to one of the most remarkable genetic legacies in human history. The Austronesian expansion, which carried human populations from Taiwan all the way to Hawaii, and eventually to Madagascar over roughly 4,000 years. The largest maritime migration in the entire span of human prehistory. That is not a small thing. That is extraordinary. And the fact it left a visible trace inside your own hair follicles is, scientifically speaking, remarkable. This whole conversation points toward something bigger than hair color. It points toward a genuine rewriting of how we understand where people across Asia actually come from. For most of the last century, the standard way of thinking about identity was national and ethnic. Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Filipino, Indian, treated as separate categories with distinct historical origins. Genetic research over the last 15 years has overturned that simple picture. What we see instead is a continuous, overlapping mosaic of ancestral threads, stretching back tens of thousands of years, connecting populations that modern political borders treat as entirely unrelated. People living along the coast of Vietnam and people living in southeastern China share ancient ancestry that predates both their modern nations by thousands of years. The people of the Philippines and the people of Taiwan share a direct genetic connection through the Austronesian expansion. The tribal communities of the Andaman Islands are genetic relatives of populations scattered across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, a living remnant of the very first human settlement of the Asian coastline. Early graying is a small window into this much larger picture, but it opens onto something profound. Your body carries a record of history going back further than any written document, any monument, or any language ever recorded. It goes back to people who stood on a shoreline or beside a river and decided to keep moving. It goes back to populations who mixed, separated, and mixed again, over and over, for tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to write any of it down. The gray in your hair is not a sign that you are getting old. It is a signature. A message passed down from people who lived, moved, and blended together long before the world had the maps we rely on today. And only now are we finally starting to read what that message says. If this kind of story changes how you think about your own identity, stay subscribed, because we release deep dives like this every week. Leave a comment and tell us where your family is originally from and whether early graying runs in your bloodline too. And if you want us to go deeper into the IRF4 research, the ancient DNA studies, or the full story of the Austronesian expansion, tell us in the comments and we will build an entire episode around it. The story of where we truly come from is longer, stranger, and far more connected than most of us were ever taught, and we are only just getting started telling it.